As I said already, this is going to be probably the hottest Sunday of the year. 98 degrees by the time it all is said and done. So I was thinking of preaching on hell, because I thought, well, this might be the Sunday to talk about hell. But when we talk about like hell and heaven and all those things, what we're talking about is God's judgment, God judging us, which is part of our teaching, that there will be a judgment. But as we heard in the gospel this morning, Jesus tells the people that are healed, don't tell people what I did. He says that a lot in the Gospel of Mark. And why is it that Jesus keeps telling people, especially in the Gospel of Mark, don't say anything? Well, because part of the problem is we oftentimes get it wrong when we talk about God. So even when we talk about hell and heaven, God's judgment, we oftentimes get it wrong, sometimes exactly wrong. And so sometimes Jesus wants to tell the church, don't talk about that. Or don't share it until you understand who I am and what I'm doing. That's why it's very important that Jesus healed someone that couldn't hear well. Because the hearing and the speaking are intimately connected. And if we have distortion or maladapted hearing, spiritual sense now, we're talking about the spiritual sense, then we won't be able to speak clearly about who God is. And as the church, which is meant to be the community of the gospel, the community of the good news, we better be clear about what we're saying. Now, I'm aware of this because as we get deeper into the election season, we have moved, and I've heard this more and more this week, we have moved from sort of like differences in party and policy to just calling people good or evil. Someone said that this week. I said, I heard someone saying that this group of people is evil and the other group is good. And they go, no, it's the wrong way. They're the evil ones and we're the good ones. Because we have this sort of tribal party affiliation. But using that language of good and evil can be very dangerous, especially if we get it wrong. And the way we speak and the way we understand is not communicating. So let me give you an example from the prophet Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah tells the people who are in exile. You heard Steve read it? He said, to people of a fearful heart. And if you have a bad heart, it's going to produce bad things. I mean, that's just natural reason. Do not be afraid. Well, you can't tell people who have a fearful heart not to be afraid because a fearful heart produces fear. So you go, well, okay, well, that's not really helpful. And we're going to talk about this later on. There's a real problem when people say the right thing but don't do the right thing. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. I'm just prefacing that. But God can say that through the prophet Isaiah because God goes, I'm going to do something about it. If you don't do anything about it, you can't tell someone, well, get better, feel better about it. I hope you have a good day. You can't, unless you're going to do something, telling them that doesn't really help. So what does God say? God goes, I'm going to visit you with my vengeance and my recompense, terrible recompense. And the people go, ooh, terrible recompense. I don't know what that is, but it sounds bad. It sounds good for us if we're afraid, but maybe we should be afraid of that too. And this, when we talk about things like God's justice and God's judgment, things like heaven and hell, we have to think, what does God mean when God says, I'm going to visit my vengeance on you? Well, interestingly enough, the prophet Isaiah, God doesn't stop there going, well, let's see if they can figure it out. Let's see what they fill into the void of their fearful imagination, producing all sorts of terrible visions. Rather, God says, this is my vengeance. I'm going to take the desert place and fill it with a pool of water. I'm going to take the place where nothing grows and I'm going to grow flowers. I'm going to take a place of death and make it a place of life. God's vengeance and God's judgment is to make sure that the creation ends up where it was meant to be. And this is why so often when we apply good and evil to different groups of people, we're just hoping that our group of people is in charge, so that we get to visit it on other people till they're in charge and they get to visit it on us. And we get stuck in a cycle that's not life-producing, it's just power sharing or shifting. And what God is doing is saying, my vengeance will be, I'm going to make you live. You are going to live whether you like it or not. You're a desert place. I'm going to fill you with pools of water. I'm going to cover you with flowers, and life is going to flourish. That's God's vengeance. That's God's judgment. That's why St. Paul even tells us, he warns us, vengeance is mine, says the Lord, because we default to merely falling into the cycle of death. We become servants of death. Even if we think we're doing it for a just cause, we end up becoming a dealer of the very wound and hurt that was visited on us that got us into the business of vengeance in the first place. And God's vengeance breaks the power of death. This is what's important. This is what Jesus is doing in the gospel this morning. He's giving us a prelude of his cross. Now he goes to Tyre and Sidon. These are two coastal cities in the Mediterranean. Very powerful. That's why it says the woman was a Syrophoenician. And they're telling you, because the Phoenicians started a colony, a very famous colony in North Africa called Carthage. You know, the Carthaginians, Hannibal and the elephants going over the Alps into Rome, and Cato saying Carthage must be destroyed every time he spoke publicly. Well, they're telling you she's not Carthaginian, she's from the Syrian part of Phoenicia, Syrophoenician, and Jesus is going to a place where he's not known. So sometimes like celebrities love to go, they go, well, I went to this south of France because no one knows who I am there, and I can be myself, and people leave me alone. Jesus goes to this Gentile port because they don't care about Jewish prophecy. They don't care about any of this stuff. That's Jewish stuff. Except one woman who's heard about him comes up and says, my daughter has a demon and I know you can help. And Jesus goes, sorry. There's a very famous, I preached on this before about, if you remember the dog of Odysseus, Ajax, the dog who, well, I'm going to do it a different way, but that was a good sermon, so go find that on YouTube and watch that one. Like, for example, so I'm not a big dog person, and we're actually dog sitting right now, which is a huge sacrifice because it's an old friend, an old friend. And she was telling us yesterday, she goes, now, if the dog wants to bite someone, just give it a treat, and the dog won't bite you. And I go, does the dog bite? And then she sent a long story about the dog biting someone in Montana. And but the end of the story was that the person who got bit was a bad person. So the dog recognized something in the person that the humans didn't until later they found out. So it's like the dog doesn't bite good people. None of us have been bit so far. So if you come over and get bit, then we'll have a few questions for you. But the whole point of this is the dog recognized something, a quality in a person that we didn't, or we don't. And this woman recognizes, so when Jesus uses this dog language, she's just saying, I just want a little touch of what you're bringing. I don't need you to fill the desert with water, and I don't need flowers and fruit. I just need a little bit of the sunshine and light that you're bringing, and that will be enough to set my daughter free. You want to know what God's vengeance looks like? God's judgment? It's when little girls are oppressed by demons and God sets them free. That's God's vengeance. People who are living oppressed and imprisoned by spiritual powers, released by that power, that's God's judgment. That's God's vengeance. God did not create us to be inhabited by evil or impurity, impure spirits. God created us to be fully alive, to have the possibility of communion. That's God's judgment. So when we talk about good and evil, heaven and hell, God's justice and judgment, we have to be very careful because God's only moving in one direction, which is toward wholeness and fullness of life, the prosperity long promised as part of the shalom of God, the peace of God that extends from heaven all the way down to the bottom. But it's actually the second healing that I want to talk about for a second, because then Jesus goes back, he goes through the Decapolis, another Gentile area, toward the Sea of Galilee, but now he's on the home turf. These are people that want what he has because they're part of the community of memory and understanding. Even if they don't hear correctly and speak correctly, they know the story. And so this guy comes who's deaf. And because he's deaf, he can't speak, because we know those two things are intimately connected. And now you get to see the craftsman at work. I mean, this is Jesus literally recreating someone before your eyes. Like we'd go, well, now we're going to have to use this medical technology, and we're going to use this and this and this. And Jesus goes, oh, forget all of that. He's like, I made this. If you believe, which we do, but hopefully you do too, if you believe that Jesus is the one through whom all things were made as God's Word, the Logos of God, then it makes sense that Jesus knows the intimate physical arrangement of a human being and what is inhibiting our ability to hear and speak these words. So Jesus literally just reshapes. And if you know, the inner ear is pretty complicated. You have all the little bones and you have the little hair and all that stuff. Jesus just recreates it. And then he uses it. I mean, it's literally like Genesis chapter 2, where God's just coming and making people out of mud. He's taking and reshaping the mud of the person so that they can be full and be fully alive. And this is what Jesus is doing with this person. And he says something very interesting. He just says one word, Ephphatha. And actually, Steve said it better than I did. But I won't make you say it again. But be opened. Be opened. This is God's vengeance. To open things that should have never been closed. to open things that have been piled on with garbage and trash and just deformity and all of the problems that happen because of a world that's twisted away from its original purpose. God's vengeance is be opened. And I would bet, no, I can't say because I wasn't there, it would be really interesting to know if on Easter morning, when Jesus came out of the tomb, if this was the first thing he said when he woke up. Because you could have said he woke up and go, whoa, I'm back, or oh my gosh, I have a horrible headache, or whatever he said. I actually think this one's pretty good, that he woke up and said, be opened, because now he's opening graves. Now we're talking about the other side of death. We're not just talking about human maintenance. Like a few of you have asked about my mother. She came out of the hospital on end of this week, and she has a pretty serious illness, but it's manageable, maintainable, until it's not. The maintenance work. We're doing the maintenance work now. But Jesus is doing something beyond maintenance. He's opening graves. And he's saying, be opened, Ephatha, be opened. He opens the guy's ears, he opens his mouth, but eventually he's going to open his grave. And so it would be wonderfully poetic if Jesus' first words on Easter were the same words he spoke to this man who was deaf, now opening the grave into the future of resurrected life. That would be the gift. So when we talk about all of these things on a hot Sunday, heaven and hell, judgment, justice, vengeance, we have the biblical testimony, and then we also have, there's an additional reading today that we didn't read, which is from the book of James, chapter 2. And it's very important because the book of James is talking about how we treat one another in the church. And this is where we get to that point of speaking and acting. The book of James will tell the Christians not just to be a hearer of the word, to be a doer of the word. Enact the story, enact the gift, enact the opening, enact the vengeance, enact the judgment, enact the filling deserts with, like we have a role in the enactment of this word. It's not just to be heard, it is to be embodied. Jesus embodies it in the incarnation, and the church is meant to embody it. And in the second chapter of James, where this reading is from, he goes against the favoritism shown in church. And he just says to people in the church, just remember, you are not supposed to live like other people. So in James's community, the problem they had is if you came in and your net worth was high, you got a better seat. If your net worth were low, they go, sit over there, just sit over there, get over there. Be away from the good seats. And James goes, you are dishonoring the poor, he says, which is not an accusation many of us are used to. You are dishonoring the poor. But what he's doing is he's dismantling the same kind of misapprehension and understanding, which is misidentifying the values of people. It is the same today as it was then, that we assume if you are a person of great wealth, you must also be a person of some kind of virtue and intelligence. And there's probably nothing more disorienting than to sit with someone who is fabulously wealthy and to find out they are the biggest idiot you've ever met in your life. You go, how can you be so successful? You can barely hold it together. And it's an interesting question sometimes to find out how they got where they got. But James says on the opposite side too, he said, these people who are poor that you're turning away, they are rich in faith and you are dishonoring them. And you are dishonoring the wealth of their faith because you have misunderstood and misapprehended. It's very similar to when Jesus tells people, don't say what I did because you're going to get the story wrong. James tells the Christian community, don't just be a hearer of the word, be a doer of the word, and enact it by the way you treat each other, understanding that all the ways that we siphon and separate each other, all of the different ways that we start categorizing people and saying you're in and you're out, you're good, you're evil, you're not part of this, or you're in, or whatever, all of that stuff has been dismantled by the one who said be opened. And now there is a radical equality of every person who steps into this place. And we see them and say, he's doing it for you too. Taking your desert places and judging them with his vengeance, filling them with water and life and verdant foliage, whatever God is going to plant in you. And you are the one that someday he's going to say to your grave, be opened. And you too will come out and share in the gift of his life. Amen.